Francis Duffield Sheldon was a geologist, part-time professor at Wayne State University, land developer, oil consultant, and author. Mr. Sheldon sat on the board of directors for the prestigious Cranbrook Boarding School, as well as the board for Boys Republic Incorporated, a psychiatric home for boys in Detroit. He also volunteered as a mentor for young boys in Ann Arbor. Only a year before, Francis Sheldon had established Brother Paul's Children's Mission, a charity organization for boys, which operated on his private island. Brother Paul's had never obtained the required licenses from the state to operate. Due to Sheldon's status, proper procedures had been overlooked. Sheldon enlisted the help of two men to establish the camp, Dyer Grossman and Gerald Richards. Dyer Grossman earned a BA from Cornell University in 1963. Grossman then taught from 63 to 73 at the Blair Academy, an elite boarding school for boys in Blairstown, New Jersey. Next, Grossman gained employment at the Harvey School in Katona, New York. There he taught science and coached wrestling from 73 to 75. Mr. Grossman spent his summers working at a very old and well-known camp in New Hampshire. Dyer Grossman was listed in Brother Paul's advertisement brochures as vice president. Listed as president was Gerald S. Richards. Mr. Richards was a gym teacher at St. Joseph's School in Port Huron, a respected member of the local Episcopalian Church, and married with a young son. Mr. Richards' friends and acquaintances were unaware that he had worked at an adult bookstore to put himself through college. It was through this job, filling mail orders for the store, that Richards had learned there was a black market for child pornography. He began keeping copies of material he received at the bookstore and mailing this off to his personal customer list. Once Richards graduated college, he incorporated his unwary wife into a magic act. The couple traveled to several states as Seymour Safety, the school magician. In 1970, Richards created Brother Paul's Educational Entertainment Missions. For this endeavor, he enlisted the help of an unsuspecting couple from his church. The new charitable organization gave Richards access to nearly every area school. Richards had the entire town fooled. Many area businesses donated to the program, and the local paper printed a large article in support. One of the reasons Richards was so popular with kids was that he physically resembled one. Jerry, as he was called, stood the height of an average 14-year-old boy and weighed only 110 pounds. Richards turned his basement into a studio. He bought a massage table, installed a deadbolt on the door, and spray-painted the windows black. He paid a 13-year-old neighbor boy, who regularly babysat for his son, to become his first model. He then used the boy to lure more minors. Most of these boys were between the ages of 11 and 15, although by his own admission some were as young as 8. Next, Richards began to place his own ads in adult magazines. He used code words buyers and sellers of child pornography understood. Two of the publications Richards placed ads in were Hermes and Better Life Monthly. Better Life Monthly was a thinly veiled code for Boy Lovers Monthly. Richards placed his ads as a magician. These would read something like this: Magician for hire. My assistant and I would like to come see you. The way Richards made money was to sell film rolls of nude boys for around $15. The reason rolls of film were sold in place of photos was because postal inspectors would not open film canisters. Richards' customers would inevitably request more graphic content. At this point, Richards could charge an extremely high price. If a customer were to make requests for specific content, Richards could charge even more. As Gerald Richards would later testify before a Senate committee, most of his customers' end goal was to either travel to meet a boy or have a boy flown to him. In an effort to lure even more victims, Richards drove an orange Pinto wagon with Jerry the Magician painted on the sides. Around 1974, one of Richards' ads in Better Life Monthly was answered by Francis Sheldon. Mr. Sheldon was a staff writer for the magazine and was a personal friend of the publisher. After 4 months of correspondence, the two finally met in person. Sheldon soon brought Richards to Chicago to meet members of his network. He was introduced to child pornographers, publishers, and adult bookstore owners. Sheldon also rented a local office space for Richards to work from, and paid for new camera equipment. At this point, Richards had officially joined the Boy Love movement. In place of his orange Pinto, the gym teacher now drove around Port Huron in a new Cadillac. Soon Gerald Richards was luring boys into flying with Sheldon to his private island. One example of this comes from Richards' campaign for St. Clair County Commissioner. Richards enlisted the help of an 8-year-old neighborhood boy to pass out campaign flyers. As a reward, Richards told the boy's parents that he would get to take a plane ride. Within days, Richards loaded the boy, along with several others who were members of his gym class, into Sheldon's plane. They were flown to North Fox Island and sexually molested. By the summer of 1975, Richards and Sheldon were prepared to start the boys' camp on the island. Over the past 3 years, Sheldon had cleared a landing strip, built a few cabins, and a small motel with a boat dock. In 1970, Sheldon and Dyer Grossman had set up a nonprofit they named the Church of the New Revelation. Grossman had even become an ordained minister to aid in this endeavor. On September 2, 1975, Grossman arrived in Michigan to help file the necessary paperwork to incorporate Brother Paul's Children's Mission. As part of the agreement, Richards met Grossman at the local Howard Johnson, bringing along a 10-year-old boy for Grossman to abuse. Francis Sheldon and his associates had incorporated 2 umbrella 501c tax-exempt organizations. If a vetted boy lover wanted to start their own operation, Grossman would arrive and help facilitate this through one of these organizations. Francis Sheldon was legally entitled to keep any surplus money any of his organizations brought in. Each of the umbrella organizations employed a different strategy. The Church of the New Revelation was regularly advertised in Better Life Monthly. Its strategy was to establish religious camps across the country, funded through charitable donations from churches, charity organizations, and private citizens. The second umbrella organization was named the Ocean Living Institute. Its strategy was to build a youth camp and science center. The Ocean Living Institute was advertised in established science magazines. Grossman printed literature which he sent to corporations and universities to solicit donations and support. Several prominent men were listed as members of the Ocean Living Institute's advisory board. Among them, John Ripley Forbes, president of the Natural Science for Youth Foundation, president of the New Hampshire Audubon Society, and founder of the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry. Another was Bailey Smith. Mr. Smith was a successful stockbroker and executive vice president of the brokerage firm Hoppen Watson Incorporated. While Forbes and Porter admitted talking to Grossman, both later denied they were on an advisory board. Finally, there was John Porter, owner and operator of Camp Cabian, a 40-year-old boys' camp located in Alton, New Hampshire. Grossman had attended the camp as a child and had recently served as camp director. Mr. Porter was a founding member of the American Camping Association. He also served as the New England Camping Association's first vice president. In 1976, Grossman was attempting to purchase a disused Girl Scout camp in the Northwest to serve as a location of the Ocean Living Institute. From this July 19, 1976 letter, sent to Gerald Richards from Mr. Grossman, we can gain some insight into how these schemes worked. After informing Richards that he is currently grooming a 12-year-old boy in California, Grossman writes, I have met several boy lover friends in this area, and also looked into foster care here. The Church of the New Revelation has recently received permanent IRS clearance for another foundation, the Educational Foundation for Youth. Meanwhile, I have been looking into foster home possibilities in this area. The state pays foster parents $180 per child per month. Some homes which take problem kids get as much as $400 per month, and the federal government pays as much as $700 per month for kids in a runaway home. All in all, it looks like a good deal, and I hope we will eventually set something up here. Meanwhile, we have acquired some property as a donation in Oregon. It is not suitable as a campsite, but it is worth about $15,000, much of which can eventually go to help set up the camp, home, etc. Anyway, do keep in touch and let me know how things are going for you. Best, Dyer. Grossman had just arrived in California after moving out of an apartment in Carmel, New York. The property manager later described the state Grossman left the apartment in. The walls were plastered with photographs of young boys, which she described as obviously being taken at a summer camp. The rooms were littered with newspaper clippings. She described Grossman as a strange man who kept odd hours. She recalled that he carried a camera with him at all times. Back in Port Huron, Richards had spent several months hand-picking victims. He personally met with the boys' mothers and told them the boys were eligible to attend Brother Paul's camp at no cost, due to their outstanding performance and character in his gym class. He explained this was possible through the generosity of his close friend Francis Sheldon. When the day finally arrived, the boys were taken to the county airport by their parents, where Sheldon was waiting in his plane. All of these boys were aged 11 to 13. Once on the island, the first thing the boys noticed was the presence of cameras. Just about anywhere they went on the island, cameras had been set up. The pedophiles employed an insidious tactic to groom the boys. They called this loss of sight. Once at Brother Paul's camp, boys would be separated from the group one at a time. At this point, a man the child was completely unfamiliar with would inappropriately touch the boy. Many kids would immediately tell the man who had brought them to the island, thus giving the chaperone a chance to convince the boy it was no big deal, and tell him it was perfectly normal. If the boy could not be convinced, or he pretended, telling his mother upon returning home, the chaperone had plausible deniability and would respond with, "I completely misunderstood what he was trying to tell me," or, "This is horrible, I had no idea." Always followed with, "I just lost sight of him for a little while." On July 23, 1976, Gerald Richards was arrested during a visit to his doctor's office. The investigation leading to his arrest began after several mothers had brought their sons to the police station. Some had been abused by Grossman and Sheldon as well. All of the boys had attended the school where Richards taught. One woman told police of Sheldon flying circles over their house to lure her son. Completely by chance, Sheldon happened to phone Richards' house during the day of his arrest. Richards' distraught wife, not knowing of Sheldon's involvement, and most likely not knowing why her husband was in jail, informed him of the arrest. Barely 4 days later, at 12:20 a.m., police executed a search warrant on Sheldon's Ann Arbor residence. Anticipating this, Sheldon had already cleaned the place out. Even though the search turned up nothing, police already had incriminating photographs of Sheldon with naked boys. They were also in possession of child pornography magazines and movies that had been filmed and photographed on Sheldon's private island. Even with this overwhelming evidence, the Washtenaw County Prosecutor's Office refused to issue an arrest warrant for Francis Sheldon. On August 2, 1976, prosecutors finally gave police an arrest warrant for Francis Sheldon. 3 days later, one of his victims put a rifle into his mouth and committed suicide. Francis Sheldon had been molesting this boy since he was 9 years old. On September 13, 1976, Gerald Richards pled guilty to criminal sexual conduct with 2 boys, 8 and 10. Dyer Grossman's arrest warrant was not issued until December 7, 1976. Exactly 1 year later, Grossman was picked up by California police along with 2 other child molesters. Police did not have sufficient evidence on him at the time to keep him in jail. By the time it was realized that he had given them a false name, Grossman had vanished. Francis Sheldon and Dyer Grossman have never been tried for their crimes. Once in jail, Gerald Richards told authorities everything he knew. Through this information, state and federal law enforcement were able to gain a clear understanding of how the boy love movement operated. Richards' information enabled investigators to infiltrate operations in multiple cities. This is a chart Richards drew for law enforcement, detailing how the child pornography business operated. In Michigan, police had Richards write an advertisement, which they then published in the Broad Street Journal. Richards crafted an ad for a non-existent boys' camp, using boy lover code words. The response was overwhelming. Pedophiles from across the country wrote in with graphic descriptions of what kind of boys they wished to pay for. Police then sent clothes photos of boys to the respondents. Next, detectives arranged meetings at hotels where the child molesters were asked to bring photos and movies of their previous crimes to trade. Over 100 men were arrested in this way, and by a single state agency using a single ad. Some defendants turned informant, and even more men were caught. By the end of the 1970s, nearly all child pornography operations in the United States were members of the boy love movement. After his arrest, Richards testified before a Senate committee that members were given codes to identify themselves. Joining the movement in its infancy, his personal code was BL-147. By the time of his arrest, less than 5 years later, the numbers were already into the thousands. Richards also testified about how victims were chosen. He listed 3 criteria that all child molesters used. The first was physical appearance and age. Second was a boy without a father present in the home, or a father who was emotionally absent due to focusing on his career or a substance abuse problem. The third was a religious background. If the boy attends church, eventually, if not immediately, the child will have a moral conflict the abuser will not be able to talk his way out of. In the midst of cooperating with police, Richards realized his assistance was not going to be enough to keep him out of prison. His next strategy was to try to make himself appear insane. To accomplish this, he wrote letters. First, Richards wrote the head of his church. In the letter, he told of how the boy Jesus had appeared to him. He was instructed by the Son of God to exact vengeance on his court-appointed psychiatrist. While in the Jackson State Penitentiary, Richards was repeatedly beaten, raped, and burned with cigarettes. His next letter was to a judge. Once again, the boy Jesus had appeared to him. Richards now understood that he was a martyr for the boy love movement, a movement he now knew to be over 1,000 years old. The judge was informed that he was on a mission from God. When Richards was released from the penitentiary, he had not served anywhere near his 20-year sentence. After losing his family, his career, and acknowledging the harm he had caused to his victims, could Richards really change? Was it possible for him to be reformed? If nothing else, could the torture he endured inside the prison keep him from reoffending? Now living with his mother, Gerald Richards was arrested once more on February 15, 1988, this time by postal inspectors. He was subsequently convicted for the distribution of child pornography. A Michigan reporter named Marilyn Wright took the assignment after a tip involving child pornography was called in. Wright broke the story of Francis Sheldon. During the mid-70s, her articles were read across the country. She brought the nation's attention to the problem of child pornography and all the horrors that surrounded it. Before her reporting, many Americans were unaware it even existed. Soon publications across the country began doing investigative reports, 60 Minutes even doing their own primetime special. This led to a Senate committee hearing on the matter. In honor of her work, the governor of Michigan drove to the Record Eagle office on New Year's Eve 1977. With Marilyn Wright standing beside him, Governor William Milliken sat down at her desk and signed a new law that carried a 20-year sentence for the production of child pornography involving anyone under 18. Brother Paul's was not Sheldon and Grossman's first endeavor. One of the longest-running tax-exempt boy love operations was located 800 miles south in the state of Tennessee. In this case, a child stable was established through the Church of the New Revelation. In 1971, Father Bud's Boy Farm was founded near the small town of Sewanee, located in rural Franklin County, Tennessee. The town's residents couldn't comprehend why it was called a farm, as the premises consisted of a 7-room A-frame house on 1.5 acres, one of the nicest and most expensive residential properties in the area. Reverend Claudius Bud Vermeil, Jr., an ordained Episcopal minister, ran the farm. He acquired many of the boys directly from the state of Tennessee, some just 10 years old. On June 29, 1958, Reverend Vermeil was placed in charge of the Episcopal Christ Church in rural Alto, Tennessee. In 1962, the Vermeils moved to Tifton, Georgia, where Bud became the pastor of St. Anne's Episcopal Church. St. Anne's was much larger than Bud's previous church. Almost immediately, the new pastor began lobbying the congregation for a boys' home, to be funded through donations alone. The parishioners were not united in the new pastor's vision, but eventually Vermeil's dogged determination paid off. In short order, the St. Anne's Home for Boys was founded by the church. In 1964, less than 6 months after the boys' home opened its doors, Vermeil made a pass at a member of the church inside of his house, as well as a boy living in the new boys' home. Members of the church board immediately brought the matter to the bishop of the state's diocese. Bishop Albert Rhett Stewart told the vestry, "Now, gentlemen, if you are about to do what I think you are, don't do it. Vermeil is going into secular employment and will receive medical care." On June 4th of 1966, Bishop Stewart accepted Vermeil's resignation as pastor to avoid an official investigation by the church. It does not appear that law enforcement was ever notified of the prior event inside the boys' home. Later that year, Vermeil left his secular employment and used his Episcopal credentials to become chaplain of the State Youth Development Center in Augusta, Georgia. Incredibly, Vermeil had been allowed to remain an ordained priest. To the detriment of the children housed in Georgia's youth center, the Episcopal Church had given no warning to state authorities before he was hired. Just months after Father Bud was installed as chaplain for the State Youth Development Center, he was banished for life. The reason has never been made public. After this, Father Bud lost his credentials as an ordained minister. Just how this was accomplished is not clear. Vermeil then moved his family back to the same area of Tennessee where he had previously been a pastor, and took a job with a commercial printing company named Curtis 1000. Upon his return to Tennessee, Vermeil joined the Tennessee Corrections Association and somehow managed to become the president of the Franklin County Mental Health Association. In this capacity, Vermeil wrote news articles on juvenile delinquency. In 1971, Vermeil's wife could take no more and finally divorced him. Unbelievably, this same year, Bishop Stewart restored Vermeil as an ordained minister. To add insult to injury, the Episcopal Diocese of Tennessee issued Father Bud with the church termed a courtesy license, which enabled him to hold Episcopal services in the state. Vermeil immediately opened Father Bud's Boys Farm. One unanswered question is how Vermeil came to own the house. He bought the property within a year of arriving back in Tennessee. However, it is unclear if the house was built at that time. What is clear is that the house was worth $500,000 in today's money when the boys' farm opened. Just how a man who worked as a sales rep for a paper company could afford such a home is a mystery. Add to that, he is able to retain the property even after his divorce. To this day, Vermille's financial backer has never been exposed. In 1971, Vermille established the Boys Farm through the Church of the New Revelation. Now the representative of an official 501c organization, Father Budd applied in probate court to have wards of the state sent to his personal residence for rehabilitation. His request was granted. Each new victim earned Father Budd monthly payments from the county as well as the state of Tennessee. Vermille's operation worked like this. Once the boys arrived, they were endlessly harassed to make pornographic films and pose nude for photos. Those who refused were denied privileges, sometimes even beaten. The boys who went along received better food, expensive clothes, and gifts. Vermille turned the attic into a darkroom. Vermille's scheme recruited sponsors through classified ads. When a donation of $25 to sponsor a boy was mailed, the sponsor would then receive a roll of 35mm film depicting a boy posing nude. If the sponsor wanted to see more graphic content, they would be charged extremely high prices. Sponsors came from nearly every state, Canada, and Australia. Vermille had a list of names totaling 270 men. Father Budd was careful to never allow any pictures of himself to be taken. He explained his reasoning for this to a sponsor who would later testify in court. Such pictures would be too hard to explain to the bishop. Part of the proceeds were used for the extensive vetting process to investigate men who wanted to visit the farm or have boys delivered to their door. Both were services offered by Father Budd. Many sponsors were refused. Those who passed the background check were deemed trusted boy lovers and were assigned a number. The vetting process was extensive. Members of the Boy Love Network would show up at the pedophiles' place of employment, inspect their homes, review their criminal records, and even their taxes. Francis Sheldon's name was later found on the visitors list, and pornography filmed at the farm was published in Better Life Monthly. On July 6, 1974, Father Budd's 22-year-old son Bill disappeared. He was last seen at a friend's apartment the previous night in Sewanee, Tennessee. Several days later, his car was located behind a building in town. Bill's wallet was then found by one of Father Budd's neighbors on the rural road leading to the boys' farm. Vermille told local police that his son was carrying about $300 in cash and that he was absolutely certain that his son had been killed and buried in the area. Shortly after this, Vermille ran newspaper ads offering a reward for information about his son. On November 4th, 1976, Father Budd's luxurious home was raided. A total of 30 boys had been victimized. Not all were sent by the state, as Vermille had used the victims living in his house to recruit local schoolboys. Investigative journalist Cliff Leindecker's book Children in Chains gives a detailed description of Vermille and one of his victims' fate. In court, a 24-year-old former friend of one of Vermille's biological sons, who was also listed on the board of directors of the boys' farm, testified that Vermille had taken pictures while he and Vermille's son had sex with 2 women. Vermille admitted in court that he had taken nude pictures of his own son and mailed them to sponsors. Vermille's attorney actually tried to use this as a defense, claiming that his client was using the pictures to reform sex offenders. A 21-year-old former resident at Father Budd's took the stand and testified that Vermille was innocent. Following his testimony, prosecutors provided the court with child pornography made on the farm, showing the faces of former residents. Father Budd was sentenced to 25 to 40 years in the Tennessee State Penitentiary. After the trial, the 21-year-old, who Vermille had convinced to perjure himself, was sentenced to 3 to 6 years in prison. The following month, Vermille's 5-bedroom A-frame house was burned to the ground. Vermille was able to remain free until his appeal was heard. After his trial, Claudius I. Vermille, Jr. was once again self-deposed from the Episcopal priesthood. This time Bishop G. Paul Reeves of the Georgia Diocese accepted Vermille's renunciation of vows. Father Budd was never formally defrocked as an Episcopal pastor. Vermille walked out of the Tennessee State Penitentiary in 1987, only having served 15 years of his 25 to 40-year sentence. Immediately after Vermille's arrest, Tennessee authorities sent the names of all men with Michigan addresses who appeared on the list of sponsors for Father Budd's Boys Farm to Michigan authorities. Here are 3 examples of who sponsored the boys, taken directly from Michigan State Police records. A 37-year-old staff member from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor told police he only sent care packages of clothing to the boys' home in Tennessee. After being shown records of his payments, the man admitted that he had received child pornography from the home but was completely shocked and broke off all contact. He had no explanation for not calling police and told detectives he had destroyed the pictures. Next was a single man who worked for the Wayne County, Michigan Department of Social Services. He claimed that he had received a brochure in the mail asking for donations. He admitted sending regular payments to the mail, but denied ever receiving anything else through the mail or visiting the boys' home. At the time of the police investigation, this man had a male foster child living in his house. Third was a Detroit area elementary school principal of 17 years, 30 years total in the school system. The principal told detectives that he had received a brochure in the mail requesting donations and claimed he sporadically donated. He then admitted to receiving child pornography from the boys' home, but stated that he threw it away, then debated as to whether he should send more money. He finally decided it would be best to continue sending money, but just once in a while. At this point, investigators showed him evidence taken from the boys' home that indicated his regular monthly payments. The principal then changed his story and told detectives that he received child pornography from the boys' home approximately 4 to 5 times. When he saw an article in the news about an investigation at the home, he decided it would be for the best if he stopped sending money. He further claimed that he had never visited the boys' home. The principal had no explanation as to why, after receiving child pornography, at least 4 times by his own admission, he destroyed all evidence in every instance and never contacted police. But how was Father Budd's operation discovered in the first place? This brings us to our next chapter in the story. In September of 1976, just 2 months before Father Budd's was raided, New Orleans police executed multiple search warrants. The first house contained a file with Vermille's address and information. Other homes contained child pornography filmed at the boys' farm. Authorities in Tennessee were immediately contacted, and detectives began the process of identifying the victims.